In this final section of our unit on the politics of poverty, I want to talk about development trajectories. I want to begin with a story told by William Easterly, which I'm going to read out to you. This is a news report from Addis Ababa, Ethiopia. Amarech, aged 10, is one of an endless line of women and girls marching into the city. Amarech woke up at 3 a.m. to collect eucalyptus branches and leaves from miles outside the city. Then, bent double under a load of firewood, she began the long and painful march across the denuded lands into the city. There she will sell it for a couple of dollars. That will be it for their day's income, as it takes all day to heft firewood into Addis and walk back. Amarech, whose name means beautiful one, is the youngest of 4 children in her family. She says, "I don't want to have to carry wood all my life, but at the moment I have no choice because we are so poor. All of us children carry wood to help our mother and father buy food for us. I would prefer to be able to just go to school and not have to worry about getting money." When another group of Western television cameramen encountered the depths of poverty in Ethiopia for the first time, they went back to their hotel rooms and cried their eyes out. This is the right response. Easterly goes on to say, the West has already spent $2.3 trillion of foreign aid over the last 5 decades and still has not managed to get 12-cent medicines to children to prevent half of all malaria deaths, or to get $4 bed nets to poor families, or to get $3 to each new mother to prevent 5 million child deaths. And Amarech is still carrying firewood. 568 billion spent on aid to Africa, and yet the typical African country is no richer today than 40 years ago. It's a tragedy that so much well-meaning compassion did not bring results for needy people. That's the view of William Easterly. So the evidence suggests that aid results in less democratic and less honest government, not more. Yet we still have such absurdities, and this is Easterly going on to describe this, we still have such absurdities as the grandiose plans by the United Nations to do 449 separate interventions to reach 54 separate goals by the year 2015, the so-called Millennium Development Goals, accompanied by urgent pleas to double aid money. Economic development happens, in Easterly's view, not through aid, but through the homegrown efforts of entrepreneurs and social and political reformers. While the West was agonising over a few tens of billions of dollars in aid, the citizens of India and China raised their own incomes by $715 billion by their own efforts in free markets. Once aid agencies realise that aid cannot achieve general economic and political development, they could start concentrating on fixing the system that fails to get 12-cent medicines to malaria victims. Easterly put this together in a book which he called Aid Isn't Working, which he called The White Man's Burden. The book is about the fact that aid isn't working. The basic argument is that aid at government level hasn't worked and won't work because of the failures of central planning. That the development should be driven by what he calls searchers in the market, people who seek out the problems and ways of solving them in a market which then tests those solutions. So that's one view. Here's an even more extreme view. Dambisa Moyo is a Zambian. She was born in Zambia. She knows about Zambia. She went to Harvard to further her education, but her parents still live in Zambia. So she speaks with some authority about what is happening in Africa, And this is the argument of her book, which she calls Dead Aid. The argument is not just that aid hasn't done any good, it is that, as far as Zambia is concerned, and probably other countries as well, aid has actually done positive harm. So over the past 50 years, $1 trillion of aid has flowed from Western governments to Africa, with rock stars and actors campaigning for more. But this has not helped Africa, it has ruined it, she says. Millions are actually poorer because of aid, unable to escape corruption and reduced in the West's eyes to childlike state of beggary. But with access to capital and with the right policies, even the poorest nations can turn themselves round. First, we must destroy the myth that aid works and make charity history. So there you have an extreme view from one point of view. Here's the opposite extreme, which I've called the left, in the sense that it sees a role for state intervention. This is Paul Collier, who wrote a very influential book about which he called The Bottom Billion, about what can be done about failures of poor countries to escape poverty. And his basic argument is that there are 4 types of trap which countries need to get out of if they are to ever escape from absolute poverty. There's the conflict trap, which countries are continuously mired in internal conflicts, internal warfare, internal coups and so on. There's the natural resource trap, which is the resource curse, where the benefits of natural resources are acquired by the elite and do not benefit the majority of the population. There's the so-called geography trap, with limited access to trade because countries are landlocked or because they suffer particular diseases. And there's the corruption trap from bad government, which sees a great deal of aid, in fact, never getting to the places that it was intended. There's a saying that very few road projects in Africa actually ever see any roads because the money gets siphoned off before it actually gets to the road building. So there's corruption in lots of countries, there's corruption in the UK, but a road project might be corrupt in the sense that it gets handed to one of the companies that are friends of the local authority, but at least the road gets built and it'll be a decent road. So there's different aspects of corruption which are, in Africa, said to be part of a trap that's really seriously endemic. His argument, therefore, is that we've got to get out of these traps, we've got to target what we do on getting countries out of these traps, and if necessary, we must use military intervention to end conflict and to establish democracy. There are examples where that's worked. Sierra Leone seems to be an example where we possibly made some progress. There are rather a lot of examples, I think, that one can put one's finger on very easily, which that doesn't seem to have worked too well. But nevertheless, that's the Collier point of view. And then we have grand development goals. The basic argument is that not that we've spent all this money on aid, but that we haven't spent near enough. That we actually, to get countries out of poverty traps, requires targeted aid. That, of course, the naysayers can point to projects that went wrong. There are plenty of projects in the rich West that go off, that cost more than their planned budgets and don't achieve their goals. But instead of concentrating on what doesn't work, we should concentrate on the fact that in certain areas aid has worked, and that if we clinically analyse what's actually required, then we can target aid to areas where it does work, and that we need countries to commit to projects that will end poverty. So Sachs has advised the United Nations on these Millennium Development Goals. I won't go through them all, you can look them up if you're interested, but essentially They are everything you might want to do to create a just and prosperous society, from eradicating hunger and poverty to achieving education, health, reducing child mortality and disease, and promoting social justice and equality, and so on. On the right of this slide, you can see the extent to which most countries fail to meet their commitment to the United Nations to fund these development programs. The idea is that each country should give 0.7% of its GDP in aid, and there are very few countries that meet that. And even in the UK, which does meet that target, which is now actually enshrined in law in the United Kingdom, there's always continuous arguments as to whether that aid is actually being used to finance corrupt practices, and whether it is actually doing the good that we think it is, or should be. So finally, looking at the problem of aid from the problem of development, from the point of view of the population of these countries themselves, that if we really approach this problem as scientists, then what we do is randomized control trials. If we're really interested in clinical economics, if we're interested in behaving as if this was a medical problem, then we'd actually do randomized trials to see what works. And while this is difficult, Bangery and Dufflo have done some of these trials and do know some of the things that actually work, and they are not these grand high-level development goals, but they are on-the-ground actions that enable people to escape from various of these poverty traps. The problem with this is the number of interventions, the number of brilliant people who need to be on the ground making these interventions to make a difference beyond the localised communities where these interventions have been made. But finally, it's not all bad news. If you look at the growth in economies globally, there are a couple on this slide in recent years, 2010, that have grown at very, very high rates. Kenya and Nigeria are sitting there amongst the high growth rate countries, and Africa has had 10 years of growth rates that are higher than the world average. So perhaps some of this is working. And if we can just have the next slide. Here you see the growth of individual countries. I've put together the data from 1950 to 2010. Very large number of countries, many of which are just moving along the bottom here, not getting richer per person, getting richer but not richer per person because their populations are increasing. There are a couple of what look like huge success stories here. We have to be careful. This is a very good moral in this. Equatorial Guinea is not a very good example of African development. It is down the bottom of countries for poor governance. There's very high levels of corruption. The wealth is concentrated, it's oil wealth, they've discovered oil, and the oil wealth is concentrated in the hands of the small elite, and most of the population still remains extremely poor. On the other hand, Mauritius is a hugely successful economy which has good governance, which has got a good for a varied service industry, and has taken off in a way that makes it one of the richest countries in Africa, and is doing very well. Finally, sustainability. It used to be thought that something like this Kuznets curve was relevant to environmental concerns, that where income is low on the left of this graph here, people don't have time or energy to be concerned about their environment. In fact, they probably make the environment worse because of their satisfying their needs. As income improves, so attention to the environment improves. And that we in the West are on this side of the graph here, where we can afford to attend to the environment. You might want to discuss whether you agree with this interpretation. It seems to me that it is very much a Western view of things, that once we all become middle class, that we can give a little bit of attention to the environment, but that it is a long way from addressing the main issues of sustainability. Where does technology come into this? There's a formula called IPAT, which looks at environmental impact in terms of population growth, wealth, and technology. And one might think that technology increases impact, but the idea of most people who promote development aid and industrial development in developing countries is that we are going to be rescued from the difficulties of sustainable resources by technology. In other words, increasing technology reduces the impact of population and affluence on the environment. And that's what we have to look for. Collier's version of this is that nature without technology and with regulation leads to starvation. Nature with technology and no regulation leads to plunder. And nature, technology and regulation, in other words, good governance and developing technology, will lead to prosperity. So the bottom line for development, progress in development, is that it needs to be driven, it needs to go hand in hand with developments in technology to address issues of sustainability, and that without improvements in technology, we shall be very hard put to achieve any of these aims of sustainable development.